Good evening. I'm Neil Brown, President of the Poynter Institute. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, what we're calling the weirdest election night ever. By now, you've undoubtedly heard the concerns, legitimate concerns, that there could be a flurry of misinformation about the vote counting, about the integrity of mail-in ballots, and that we could have massive confusion on election night. This poses a threat to our democracy. We know these concerns are not far-fetched. Journalists have been reporting on these issues for months. But we also know it's possible because it happened before. 20 years ago, the nation watched while those of us here in Florida, where the Poynter Institute is based, lived through that chaos. Many of you remember election night in 2000. That night, the most respected TV networks and news companies pronounced Al Gore the winner of Florida less than 1 hour after the polls closed. But then, as the night went on, it looked like George W. Bush actually had a huge lead in Florida. So at 10 p.m., the TV networks and other news organizations retracted their decision and said it was likely that Bush had won. At 2:30 in the morning, believing he had lost Florida and hence the election, Gore called Bush and conceded. But then Bush's vote lead got smaller and smaller. And so 45 minutes later, headed to make his concession speech, Gore called Bush again and took back his concession. Bush said, "Hey, no takebacks." Within hours, Florida was flooded with some of the most powerful and expensive lawyers in the nation. There were hanging chads and tension and pushing and shoving while votes were being counted. The election ultimately was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, and Bush had won the presidency by 537 Florida votes. Election night that year took 31 days. Talk about weird. Now, who wants to top that? Nobody. But this year could, in fact, be even stranger. Back in 2000, there was no talk of foreign government interference. There was no social media. It was 4 years before Facebook existed and 6 years before Twitter. And today, we are voting in the midst of a global pandemic. Since 2000, journalists and the TV networks have changed the way they report. And citizens more and more understand that they must be smart consumers of credible information. We all must keep expectations realistic. We must understand that in some places it will take days to accurately count the votes. We are all here as part of that vital collaboration between journalists and citizens. Poynter, a global center for journalism training, is a crossroads for conversations that advance democracy. Tonight, thanks to our sponsors at Facebook, we will share insights on how voting and a free press can work together. The first part of the program will focus on how votes are counted and how newsrooms project winners. In our second panel, we'll talk about fighting misinformation. So thank you for joining us tonight. It should be a great program. Now let me turn it over to Eric Deggans, the TV critic for NPR. Over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Neil, and welcome everyone to the weirdest election night ever, where we are going to explore what the public needs to know about the media, the 2020 election, and a working democracy. First, I'm going to introduce our distinguished panel. Caitlin Conant is political director at CBS News. Sally Busby is the senior vice president and executive editor of the Associated Press. Jeffrey Skelly is an elections analyst at ABC News' data journalism platform 538. And Joe Linsky is co-founder and executive vice president of Edison Research, which conducts exit polling for the nation's major news organizations. I'm told by the organizers that Fox News was invited to provide a representative for this panel, but they declined. Now, this event is airing on several different social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, pages maintained by the Poynter Institute, PolitiFact, and MediaWise. Now, if you'd like to submit a question for our panel to answer at the end of the general questions that I'm going to ask, why don't you post it in the comments section of those platforms? Go to where the Poynter Institute or where PolitiFact is streaming it and just put a comment there. We have moderators who will grab those questions and present the most interesting of those to me, and then I'll ask those of the panel towards the end of our talk. So let's get started. Jeffrey, give it to me straight, man. How bad is this election night going to be? Am I going to be stuck in my in my PJs and my house shoes for a whole week waiting for election results. I actually want to ask you a serious question, though. I want to start with the subject that seems closest to the audience's heart these days, which is polling. There's a deep cynicism, I think, among the public about what the polls told us leading up to the 2016 election and how they may have been wrong. Everyone expecting Hillary Clinton to win, but Donald Trump indeed won. Yet I've heard experts this year insist that the polling from back then wasn't necessarily all that wrong, and that we can trust the polling that we're hearing now more. Jeffrey, can you explain how that both of those things might be true, that that we were led to believe something in 2016 that didn't happen, but that didn't necessarily indicate that the polling that we were seeing was off base?
Sure. Hey, thanks. I think the sort of the takeaways from the 2016 election come down to looking at national polls versus state polls. And the national polls, generally speaking, were pretty good. They were rather accurate, historically speaking. But in certain states, especially some of the most important battleground contests, places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, across the Midwest in particular, I think you did see a number of state polls that were off. And in the aftermath of the election, the American Association of Public Opinion Research looked at all the polling, state and national, trying to sort of make sense of what had happened. And some of the takeaways they had were that many polls had sort of underrepresented white voters without a college degree. And that was a block of voters who went very strongly for President Trump. And by underestimating him, the polls were underestimating his overall percentage. And since you're talking about the largest block of voters in the entire electorate, that's pretty significant. And so it was no wonder in states where they formed a disproportionate amount of the electorate, since states like Pennsylvania and Michigan are wider than the country as a whole, it's no wonder maybe that they missed the mark. And the other takeaway was basically that the role of undecided voters and voters who said they were planning to vote for a third party was maybe undercovered in the news coverage and sort of underrated as an aspect in what happened in the final election result. One of the takeaways was that undecided voters went pretty strongly for President Trump. You saw that in the exit polls. You saw that in other polling analysis as well. And if you look at the polls this year, in 2020, if you add up President Trump's percentage, roughly about 42% in 538's polling average right now, and Joe Biden's percentage, about 52-ish, 52, 53, I mean, you're talking about 94, 95% of people saying they're planning to vote for one of the major party candidates. Conversely, in 2016, you were in the mid-80s, even at this point. And that just shows how many more people were undecided or planning to vote for a third party candidate. And at the end of the day, a lot of people who say they're going to vote for a third party candidate don't end up voting for a third party candidate. So that was a source of great uncertainty. And I think that was undercovered in 2016. That was one of our takeaways when looking back at what happened. So thinking about waiting for college education, that's something a lot of pollsters have shifted to doing in the wake of the 2016 election. I recently wrote an article about this where we talked to a bunch of pollsters, and a number of them said that, okay, when we're taking a sample, we weight that sample to reflect the public as a whole, or the voters, the electorate. But previously, some pollsters weren't necessarily making sure that their weights accounted for education that specifically. But now, given that education, maybe after race, is like the second most important indicator of voting intention, pollsters are trying to take account of that now by specifically weighting their samples when they're figuring out what their sample shows to make sure it's accounting for that very important variable.
Cool. Caitlin, you and I were on a similar panel like this presented by Poynter some time ago, and we spent a lot of time there talking about the possibility that election night might actually be an election week or election month. Do you have any better sense now whether that will be the case, how long it will take to find out the results of this election, and how have you been preparing both viewers and your staffers for that eventuality?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It's good to talk to you all again. This is obviously an important topic, and it's something I think that all of the media are taking very seriously. And I think that we need to prepare the public to potentially have patience, and that is important because this is a state-by-state election, and states have different voting rules. So some states process ballots ahead of election day, and so when the polls close, we could have a good sense of where of having those mail-in ballots, knowing where people voted. That includes places like Florida, North Carolina. But then when you get to the Rust Belt, right now, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, they do not process ballots ahead of election day. And so I think if the margins are if it's tight, we could not know for a few days based on state rules. We have to prepare the public to have patience if that happens, which is something I'm not very good at. I don't think most people are good at, especially right now in this environment. But there's also a scenario where we could potentially know on election night if it is not a tight race. And so I think we need to lay all those options out. We've been doing that at CBS News by having a team who is focused on this for the broadcast. We assigned Major Garrett, who is our chief Washington correspondent, to be the main correspondent to do stories basically on the state level about just breaking down the rules in general, to also talking about ballots that right now we're seeing that are being rejected, why there are higher rejection rates somewhere, what people and groups are affected most by that. We've done stories on poll worker shortages and steps that states have had to take to make in-person voting safer during coronavirus, and exploring all those angles so that hopefully, if we've done our job, by the time we get to election day, I think people will know that whether we have the results that night or we don't have the results for a few days, a week, whatever that might look like, it doesn't mean that something bad happened. It's just the process playing out. And I think that's really important for us to make sure that people aren't surprised.
Okay, Sally, America's media seems to be in a unique position when we talk about elections because, other countries may have election commissions that actually announce the results of elections after the voting is done. But here in America, our news media does that. And in particular, the Associated Press has a strong role there. You wrote a column where you talked about how AP is going to collect and verify election returns in every county, parish, city, and town across the country, something like 7,000 contests you're going to process. Can you talk a little bit about how you're going to pull that off and whether or not because this election is so contested and so divisive that it makes it tougher to do something like that where the media is expected to announce election results rather than say some sort of official government entity?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about the United States is that it has a very decentralized election system, as you say. So it's really, in a presidential election, like 50 states are each running their own election. Each state officially reports the results. That's what the Electoral College eventually is. Electors are, chosen, and there's an official process laid out in the Constitution. But it doesn't really happen until December. And so way back, more than 100 years ago, people wanted to know, as early as they could, what all those results together meant for the presidency. And so long ago, we started counting the vote. And what that means is that we go to every state, we get their results, and we put them together, we tabulate them, and then we say, we put that vote count out to people, and then we call races based on that. Now, in reality, what happens is that you actually go to the county level, because counties, generally speaking, run elections. They report their results up to states, and the states eventually release them. But you can get it faster if you go to county level, precinct level, and that kind of thing. So what we have is essentially a network of journalists, a network of stringers, who essentially have a massive reporting effort on election night where we gather all this information. We call states, we scrape their websites, we call county officials. Sometimes we're right next to county officials. We're in their offices. And as they publicly release those results, we're gathering all of them. We're collating them all together. We're checking them for, data mistakes and things like that. We're not checking to make sure that the results are right. What we're checking is, like, if a county reports, 800 votes, and we know there's only 700 registered voters in that county, then there's, red flags that look for bad data, basically. So we put it all together, and then we send it out. We send it to news organizations all across the United States and all across the world. And we do that for the presidential race. We do it for the Senate races. We do it all the way down to state legislative races, and sometimes even for big referendums. And so essentially it is, the news organizations in the United States developed this role simply because there isn't any federal election agency. There isn't anyone on election night who gathers all this together except the media and reports it. And so then we do race calls. When it is obvious that there has become a winner, then we essentially say this person has won. And that is a very, that's a mathematical process. It's an analytical process. There's a whole lot of things that go into it. So for example, a very simple example is that some states have automatic recount rules. If one person has won by such a tiny margin that the race is very close, there might be an automatic recount triggered. And so what we say, the way that we explain our race calling in sort of the most fundamental way, is that we don't call a race until it is absolutely obvious that the trailing candidate has no path to victory. And then we will say this person has won that race. So there's a lot of things that go into that, the vote count, either the exit polls, or we use a different methodology called vote cast that tries to gather early voters' opinions and things like that. We do some sampling of key precincts, and obviously we do a ton of research. I mean, there are voting patterns in the United States that provide us a lot of guides so that we know, for example, which parts of states tend to vote Republican and which parts of states tend to vote Democratic. But at its absolute core, it is based on just math, counting the vote count, and then saying who's going to win the race, who has won the race.
Okay. Joe, I want to ask you sort of a different version of the question I asked Caitlin. How likely is it that we will not know who won this election on election night? And what are you going to be looking for in exit polling in particular to get a sense of how the night might go?
It's all going to depend on the margin of victory nationally. Each state reports differently. Some states are going to report very quickly. Some states are going to report very slowly. And it's just a matter of the states that are reporting quickly giving us enough information to project a candidate to win 270 electoral votes, or whether the states that are going to be the tipping point states, the ones that are going to put a certain candidate over the top, are going to take a while to report their votes. This is a process that happens every year. It's just more exaggerated in this year because of the corona environment and because of such a tremendous increase in the use of by-mail votes. But I've been doing this for 32 years. I started at CBS News covering the 1988 presidential election, and elections drag on. The vote count drags on. It just tends to drag on in a high-profile environment once you call the winner of the presidential race. So I can't tell you right now whether we'll have a winner with 270 electoral votes on election night, whether we'll have it the next morning like we did in 2004, or whether it'll take days or weeks like it did in 2000. All those are possibilities, but it's always a possibility. There will be other races that will not be called. In 2018, the Senate and governor's race in Florida went to recounts, and those races weren't called for days later. There were half a dozen, if not more, House races in California and other states where the votes were not definitive on election night to call a winner, and that will happen again in House races and Senate races across the country. So this is a process that takes days in a normal situation, and in 2020, it's going to be even more exaggerated than previous elections.
I remember in 2000, for example, the use of exit polls was controversial, and I do believe that some media outlets changed how they used them as a result of what happened in 2000. What's your sense about how news outlets are using polling data now to report on the election and the race, and in particular, how exit polls might be used in this upcoming election?
Yeah, I think our clients at the National Election Pool, ABC, CBS, CNN, and NBC, and our subscribers at Reuters and other news organizations, I think are very conscious of the use of exit polling for analytic purposes and very cautious of the use of exit polling to project elections based solely on exit polls. In fact, you will not see any projections of winners based solely on exit polls except in landslide elections on November 3rd. But exit polls are part of several tools that are used. Sally talked about how the AP does it. We do something very similar. We have exit poll data, which is made up both of in-person exit poll interviews on election day, in-person interviews of early voters at early voter locations around the country, which we're doing right now as we speak around the country, and telephone interviews of people that are voting by mail. Those are the three components of the exit poll survey results that we report on election day and election night. In addition to that, we have sample precincts where we have reporters at sample precinct locations around the state to get quick returns that we can add to our model. And then we also collect the county vote as the AP does. And we use all three of those sources of information to give us statistical confidence that we can project a winner using 99.5% confidence. And in 2020, I think we're going to want even more confidence because we are seeing such an increase in by mail voting. And also we're seeing such a divergence in who is using by mail voting versus who is voting on election day. We have seen both in all the pre-election polling and also in the party registration statistics in states that have started by mail and early voting. The Democrats are much more likely to plan to use by mail voting this year, and Republicans are much more likely to plan to vote on election day. And those types of differences you have to keep account of, especially in states where one type of vote may be reported faster than the other type of vote.
Yeah, Jeffrey, I wanted to ask a question related to that. I remember back in 2018, some news outlets were criticized for not perceiving quickly enough the blue wave that actually was an effect, was a result of the elections in 2018, the success of Democratic candidates, because it took a while for those election results to come through. And on election night, it looked like Republicans had done better than actually they had. That people realized that Democrats had done better once they had a few days to have vote totals come in through mail. Is that a fair criticism of how the election was reported in 2018? And have there been any changes to make sure that that possible blue wave, if it happens in 2020, will at least viewers will be prepared to understand that the results might change over the next few days?
Right. So, I mean, in 2018, I think particularly where we saw this happen were in a couple states. California has a very long counting process because they will accept votes they're postmarked by election day, but they could arrive, a few days after the election. And so there were a few House seats where it took a while to get a final call out there. And also the Arizona Senate race, which on election night, Republican Martha McSally was leading, but then by a few days later, once they were getting close to completing the count, Democrat Kyrsten Sinema had taken the lead and ended up winning. And so I do think that maybe some media organizations didn't cover that as sort of like, well, the vote is moving, but at the same time, you have to remember that this process of having so many more ballots to count after election day is new as well to a lot of media organizations. So I think the 2018 experience, if anything, was good preparation for 2020. And I think thinking about the public at large, you have polls where, yes, maybe 30, 35% of respondents say they do expect to have a winner on election night. I would love for that figure to be lower, because 538's been prepping for it to be election week or even election month for a while now. But at the same time, that still suggests that 60, maybe even 65% of the public is like, well, maybe it'll be the next day or a few days after that. And so I do think it's reassuring that you do see a lot of Americans saying, you know what, I'm not really expecting an election winner in the presidential race to be called on election night. That's reassuring. And I think that as long as media organizations keep pushing that message of look, there's a lot of uncertainty in just how the count's going to come in. A lot of states are doing something they haven't done in the past, which is having very, very large scale use of vote by mail. Those sorts of explainers and talking to people and readying them for it, I do think there's been some impact given what you see in those polls, and also the message does seem to have gotten through to some extent.
Caitlin, I wanted to ask you, James Fallow wrote an article for The Atlantic recently that said that the news media seemed to be repeating the same mistakes that it made in 2016, leading up to that election. In particular, he cited giving Donald Trump too much coverage that boosted his profile and focusing too much on a scandal that turned out to not be all that relevant. In 2016, it was Hillary Clinton's emails, and there's some concern about this Hunter Biden story now. How do you ensure that when you're covering the election, you're holding Joe Biden to account, but at the same time, you're not falling prey to maybe some of the overcoverage or the problems that we saw in 2016 that may have distorted the election process back then?
Yeah, so I'll start. I think we are all very careful and cautious that we don't want to repeat any of those mistakes. And I can say at CBS News, at least with the latest story with Hunter Biden, which you mentioned specifically, we have tried very carefully and had deliberations to make sure that we are providing appropriate context and to say what we know, but even more important, what we don't know when it comes to that story. And I think also that means, we did a piece on Evening News, I believe on Friday, with our chief congressional correspondent, Nancy Cortez, who also covered the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016. And she made the comparison to 2016 and the emails and about how this seemed to be the same, could appear to be the same playbook. And so I think we spend a lot of time making sure that we are saying what we know, what has not been substantiated, trying to do our own original reporting. And then on top of that, pointing out the issues that matter in this election, which are still the economy and healthcare, and putting it into that bigger picture. Now, when it comes to larger mistakes of 2016, I think from my perspective, we've talked a lot about polling here and polling in the states. And I think as equally as important as polling in the states is talking to voters and listening to voters in the states, which is something I think people just didn't do enough. And I think I said this last time we talked, Eric, but one of my biggest concerns at the beginning of the pandemic was my team of campaign reporters or campaign embeds moved home with mom and dad. And so they were covering battleground states from their parents' couches. I'm in my living room right now. And it's hard to get out of the bubble and get a sense of what's really going on when you're not there and you can't have honest conversations. And I'm thankful now that with our safety protocols and making sure that people are keeping themselves healthy, we have moved reporters to the battleground states. But I was extremely nervous. I basically assigned them all in April to start covering states remotely. And as part of that, it was sourcing up, which I knew was going to be incredibly difficult to do over Zoom because, let's be honest, Zoom is really awkward. And I think it's hard to, as a national reporter, I think it's hard to make local sources anyway, even when it looks like you're parachuting in for part of an election cycle. So that's even harder when you're not there. And then another part was to start a series for .com, which we called the COVID Chronicles, which was just to find voters who worked in certain industries and talk to them about how this had changed their lives, what it made them rethink. We've gone back to them throughout the course of the cycle, and it wasn't overtly political, but I just thought it was really important to make sure that we're out of the coasts and in battleground states, because this is a state-by-state election. And I think that was one of my main takeaways from 2016 and something that I really wanted to prioritize in my shop. And I was really, really fearful that the pandemic would, even despite our best efforts, inadvertently force us to make some of those mistakes again and maybe miss the story.
Right. Well, Sally, I want to turn to you too, because you're directing a lot of coverage here. And in that article, another thing that James Fallows criticized was this idea of both siderism, this idea of trying to find balance in stories where there may not be balance. And again, that Hunter Biden story might be a good example. If it's not valid, if it's based on inaccurate information or based on some sort of partisan, effort, you have to be careful about how you characterize it. So, what do you think about those criticisms that mainstream traditional journalists have had a hard time covering this White House and covering this election because of that both siderism that has led to normalizing conduct that maybe shouldn't be normalized, or equating things that shouldn't be equated?
Yeah, I think, first of all, before I answer that, I want to say that I completely agree with everything that Caitlin just said. I think that she made a lot of really good points about, not just the importance of, just this whole kind of getting out of the East Coast bubble and actually talking to the country. That really is sort of the basics of political reporting, and we sometimes forget that it's so important to sort of keep making that point. So I think, to answer your question, we're in a really fascinating and also very challenging time in journalism. So I think 2016 was sort of the acceleration point of the disinformation that has, in my view, just kept accelerating since that. I personally feel I've lived about, 35 lifetimes since 2016, and that the challenges have continued to sort of exponentially get bigger, okay? So all I can really talk about is how we try to do this. First of all, we have some benefits because we really do have a footprint of journalists across the country. So, we are protected ever so slightly from the idea that, that we're just kind of elites on the coast. We have journalists who are actually in that community. And I do see that sometimes, we'll have weird things happen where a locally based reporter will go and talk to someone, and they'll be talking and they'll like rail against the mainstream media. And the person will say, well, I work for AP, it's a national news organization. And one time this woman said, oh, I wasn't talking about you, honey. I know you live here. I was actually talking about those other journalists, right? So, there is some benefit to people thinking that they actually understand the journalists understand who they are, that kind of thing. So that's one thing. For my news organization, what we have tried to do is, I think everything that Fallow said in that article is very on point. But there's a second risk, which is the second side, which is that if you become too pointed and you become too snarky or partisan or something like that, then half of the audience is also just going to tune you out. Our goal as a news organization is to have very strong accountability journalism that essentially attacks disinformation in real time, but to tell it in a very sort of sober and non-snarky and non-partisan way, so that the whole range of people on any side of a political spectrum will find our journalism accessible. I don't see any benefit to, being so sort of partisan in our tone that half of the audience just essentially tunes us out and says, I'm sorry, it may be great journalism, but I'm not going to pay attention to it because I think these people are just biased. So for me, the biggest challenge for journalists right now, and I hope we're doing a good job at this, is to be strongly fact-based, to be strongly accountable, to fact-check and attack disinformation as close to real time as possible, but to make our journalism accessible to people on all sides of the political spectrum. I assume, a flaming racist is not going to ever find our journalism acceptable, so I'm not trying to convince people who just don't believe in facts and are in the thrall of conspiracy theories. But I think there's a lot of people who might be susceptible to conspiracy theories, but are also susceptible to good fact-based journalism. And our goal is to present our journalism in a way that is accessible to people. And so for me, the main thing, I think, has been to keep a partisan tone out of our journalism, and to keep people believing that we are operating in good faith and that we are trying to fairly reflect a wide range of views in this country. Now, we're not trying to fairly reflect outright racist views. We're not trying to, fairly reflect the viewpoints of neo-Nazis or anything like that. But we are trying to say that the whole spectrum of political view in this country, that we are actually trying to fairly report on that. So that's our strategy. We're doing our best. I don't know if it's exactly the right thing to do, but I do feel that, kind of what Jeffrey said. There's some decent polling that shows that despite all the fear mongering that's going on in our world, that people are looking for facts on election night. And I view that as, and if the election goes long, they'll want us to explain transparently why the election is going wrong. And if we, I think one of the most powerful tools that journalists have is transparency. So if on election night we say, hey, look, we haven't called Pennsylvania because elections officials in Pennsylvania say that there are 250,000 outstanding votes that they haven't counted yet, and that could change the outcome of the election. My personal feeling is that that sort of fact-based statement on election night will generally be, accepted by large numbers of the public. So that's our strategy.
So, but what if you have a candidate who either declares victory before you've confirmed it, or resists your declaration that someone else won?
So our plan is to very calmly and in a fact-based way say why that claim is invalid. We're not going to get in a fight with anyone. Obviously, we're not going to get involved in partisan fights, but we are going to stand by our facts and say, that race is not decided because the state has not counted all the votes. And so we intend to be firm and transparent and public about what is happening on election night. And it is my hope that citizens of the United States will look for fact-based information. And I don't expect anyone to trust us just on my word. Go back and look at our history. We have called races for a very, very long time. We declared, as did everybody on this call, declared President Trump the winner in 2016 when the facts showed that he was the winner. So most of us believe in facts, and we don't do this with fear or favor. We believe in math, and we will say who the real winner is once that is apparent.
Okay, I'm going to start asking some questions from the audience in a minute, but I wanted to ask Joe one more question. Joe, do you have a sense of what areas of the country you're particularly interested in terms of judging whether this is something that you can call relatively quickly or something that will take a week or longer? And do you have any sense about what you're looking at? And also, do you have any sense, I'm also interested in if you have any sense about what the general public generally doesn't understand about polling in elections, and maybe some areas of confusion that you often have to clear up when you're talking to members of the general public about how this process works.
Well, the first thing to talk about, the exit poll, it's a survey like any other survey. And the exit poll has a margin of error just like any other survey. It's a large operation. We'll be talking to tens of thousands of voters on election day. We've already talked to thousands of early voters, and we will talk to tens of thousands of voters by telephone who vote by mail. But it is a survey like any other survey, and it'll have a margin of error. The other point I make is, as I said earlier, races are not called solely based on the exit poll, except in blowout landslide elections. Any tight election, we will wait until we have precinct returns and county returns until we make that judgment. In terms of geography, though, I think we've stressed that this is a 50-state election, and each state runs their process differently. Each state will count certain votes faster than other votes. Certain states will be more complete on election night, and certain states will drag on. I think what is going to be very interesting is the geography within these states. And I think you're going to see a general pattern in many states that the smaller counties, the more rural, less populated counties are going to be reporting faster than the more urban, highly densely populated counties. We saw that in the primaries, especially in Pennsylvania, where Philadelphia took a long time to report. We already know from election officials in Milwaukee that they don't expect to process all of their hundreds of thousands of by-mail ballots until at least 3 in the morning, maybe 6 in the morning. So you have to be very transparent, not only when you're looking at a statewide vote total, but where within that state those numbers are coming from. And if without any absentee ballots being reported from Milwaukee, Trump is going to look a lot better in the statewide totals in Wisconsin until that batch of vote comes in from Milwaukee, which may be enough to put Biden over the top. So don't just look at the statewide totals, look at where they're coming from within the state. And I think our clients at the networks do a really good job of, through their graphics, through their big walls, through their analysts, looking at the data within the state and showing by geographic region who is reported and who is left to report.
Okay, so in the questions that have come in from the audience, we're getting several questions about Trump challenging the validity of the election. And one question in particular asked if Trump objects, is his first recourse to the courts, and does he have to file in each state? Do any of you know the answer to that question?
Well, the process does vary by state to state, but it is a state by state process. And usually you don't go straight to the courts, you go to the election officials and question ballots that you think should be counted, or ballots that shouldn't be counted. But we've seen a lot of court cases this year, even before the election, in terms of rules changes, in terms of deadlines for ballots to be returned. Just this past week in Michigan, originally the deadline for returning ballots had been extended to November 17th, and then a judge ruled last Friday that no, the ballots have to be back till November 3rd. So we have already seen many court cases involving the rules of the process. What you tend to get after the election are challenges both at the Board of Election level, either the county or the state, in which ballots should be counted and which ballots should not be counted. And then eventually those will make their way into the courts if it's a really close race.
And I think I would just add one thing. I think the practical answer to the question from the person on the phone is that he's only going to focus on battleground states, or states that, his lawyers, if they're, or anybody's lawyers, any candidate's lawyers, they're just trying to get to 270 electoral votes. And so presumably they would have a strategy. It's hard to imagine any candidate who would fight in every state. What they would do is probably pick the states where they thought they had the best option and where they could, get to 270 electoral votes. Okay. So, I mean, it's fairly unlikely that, for example, Biden would ever have any hope in this election cycle of winning the state of Mississippi, for example. And so why would he launch election fights in Mississippi, or why would Trump launch election fights in, I don't know, a very liberal state or something like that. So they'll focus, if there is a fight afterwards, they'll focus on the battleground states that could help them overturn or get to 270 votes.
I wonder too if the prospects of a court challenge might be another way in which election night gets extended. It might not just be about counting votes. It might be if there's a lot of close results, or if there's results where one side or another feels like they can challenge them, maybe they step in and challenge right away. Aren't we hearing that both sides have their teams of lawyers already preparing strategies for how to respond to what happens on election day?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I don't know if this will happen, but if there were any sort of large disruptions or something like that that prevented people from voting, I think there would probably be legal challenges asking for polling places to stay open so that people could, actually vote or something like that. I mean, oftentimes when there are very long lines at polling places, someone will go to a local judge and say, keep the polling place open so all these people can vote. I think one of the uncertainties about this election is if there were disruptions of the polls, which we don't know that there are, but if there were that kind of thing, that could involve legal challenges that said, these people are disenfranchised, they need to have a chance to vote. And that could affect the race, or it could not affect the race, depending on what states and localities it happens in.
I've always wanted to do this. Breaking news. Apparently, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania will count if they are received within 3 days of Election Day in a 4-4 ruling. So, election news even during our election panel.
Wow, right, okay, wow.
These rulings keep happening. We're just keep us on our toes.
I feel like an anchor now. I'm ready. I'm ready for CBS. Caitlin, just put in a good word for me. All right. So another question from the audience. How great an impact does a presidential race have on down ballot races? And can we, do we have a sense about how that dynamic may work in this election? Anyone can take that, by the way.
Well, I'll just take the fact, and I think, Jeffrey, you guys have talked about this a lot at 538, is 2016 was the first election since popular elections of popular vote for the Senate that every race, the same party won both the president and Senate race in that state. There was no split in any race in any state in 2016 between the party who won the presidential race and the party who won the Senate race.
Wow.
So that's the first time that's ever happened. Now, that may happen again. There'll probably be a few states this year where there's a split, but at least at the Senate level, the Senate and presidential votes are becoming more and more correlated over the years. And even at the congressional district level, over the years, the presidential vote and the House vote has become more and more correlated over the past few cycles. So that's a pattern we've seen, and I'm expecting that pattern to continue in 2020.
Jeffrey, what do you think that indicates in terms of the electorate?
I think generally speaking, you see an increase, or at least a consistency in the amount of straight ticket voting. That is, or conversely, less split ticket voting. Fewer people saying, well, I'm going to vote for the Democrat for president, the Republican for Senate, and then the Democrat in my House district or what have you. If you're voting for one party at the top of the ticket, there's a very good chance you're going to vote for that party all the way down. Now, that's not like unheard of in U.S. history, of course, but I think things are so polarized right now politically that there just aren't a lot of situations where I think you have candidates who are able to draw significant shares of voters who might normally vote for the other party. Now, there are candidates who might have a little bit more crossover appeal than others, but it's just very challenging in this day and age for a candidate to just pull in a ton of people who might have voted for the other party's presidential candidate. If you're, a Senate candidate or a House candidate, there are exceptions to that, but it's become just more and more apparent that that's unusual. And you can see this show up in things like what's called like the incumbency advantage. For senators and members of the U.S. House of Representatives, there was a time when being an incumbent was practically a guarantee of winning re-election, particularly in the U.S. House. However, nowadays, there really isn't that much of a benefit for incumbents on top of sort of the vote you would expect based on what the electoral environment and the district you're looking at. Now, incumbents on average get maybe 2-3 more points in the House than you might expect otherwise. And it used to be much, much, much larger than that. So that things are just very polarized, and voters are going to stay in one camp for the most part, all the way up and down the ballot.
Yeah, just adding to that quickly, I think, unlike 2016, we are not seeing a whole lot of undecided voters right now. We're 2 weeks out. People seem to have a team. And I think it is hard as a Senate candidate, incumbent, or, running against incumbent, to kind of localize your race these days. Everything is more nationalized, and again, is in the context of the presidential, national politics, what news you watch. And so I think we see that reflected down ballot oftentimes. And just from a practical standpoint, for election night too, as we said, all these races are state by state, and Georgia is a place where they have runoff rules. So we could have 2 Senate races in Georgia that we might not know until I think January. Don't quote me on that. Everyone's right.
January 5th, you got it right.
Yeah. So, I think there's all these scenarios that we're just planning for, and everyone has said it here, but to button it up, we just need to be transparent throughout the night, leading up to the night, about what we know and what we don't know, and why that is, based on the historical county data and the demographics and what the margins are, and if people voted by mail or voted in person.
Well, Caitlin, I'm going to give you the last question, and I'm going to do you the way a lot of TV anchors do their subjects. You got 30 seconds. We're coming up on an election that people have been anticipating for a long time. What is your advice for getting through election night for the average viewer?
The average viewer. I said this at the top. I think just going into the night, that even though we've been anticipating this night for a long time, and you might want an answer, that you might have to have some patience. And I think, as consumers of news too, I say this goes back to the listening point, but I think just try and diversify what you're reading, what you're watching. who you follow on Twitter, because it's really easy to just only listen to people who agree with the same thing you do. I can't control that. It's a personal choice. But I'm going to say it here because I think it's an important point to make, just to try and make sure you're getting all sources and hearing different points of view as you head into the election.
Makes sense. Guys, thanks so much for participating. We're at the end of our time. I could talk to you about this all night, but there's another panel coming up, right? So thanks to Caitlin Conant, who's political director at CBS News, Sally Busby, who's senior vice president and executive editor at the Associated Press, Jeffrey Skelly, who's an elections analyst at ABC News' data journalism platform 538, and Joe Linsky, who's co-founder and executive vice president of Edison Research. Thank you so much, guys. Viewers, thank you so much for joining us, and please stick around for the next panel. But before that starts, we've got a special message for you, so check it out.
Hey everybody, I'm Amna Nawaz, and I'm a correspondent with the PBS NewsHour. Look, now more than ever, we are all spending a lot of time online, and sometimes it can be really difficult to sort out what's true from what's false on our timelines. Remember, misinformation can take a lot of different forms, and sometimes false claims aren't so blatantly obvious. So if you come across something that you're not sure about, it is crucial that you give it a quick fact check before resharing. And a good place to start is by asking yourself these 3 quick questions developed by the Stanford History Education Group. Number 1, who is behind the information? This might be the most important question of all. Do a little digging and see who shared this and why. Are they an expert, or would they gain something from you sharing this? Number 2, what is the evidence? What proof do they give you to back up the claims? Are there links to studies or testimonials or photos or videos? And number 3, what are other sources saying? Get off the page that you're on. Get out of your own echo chamber and learn what multiple sources are reporting. Look, variety in platforms and perspective will give you some great and necessary context. Look, these are the same questions that professional journalists like me and fact checkers use all the time, so you know that they work. So put them to use. Tell your friends, and thanks for watching.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our second part of the weirdest election night ever. I'm Angie Drobnik-Holan. I'm editor-in-chief of PolitiFact, the national politics fact-checking website that's part of the Poynter Institute. And I'm here to lead the questioning tonight as we think about fact-checking and misinformation and how to make sure that voters get information that is factual, accurate, and credible. We have a wonderful panel here tonight. I will go through a brief round of introductions. We have Daniel Funke. He is the staff writer at PolitiFact who covers misinformation. He previously reported on international fact-checking for the Poynter Institute, and he was the Google Lab Fellow. We have Kate Starbird. She's the Associate Professor of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. Her research looks at how people use social media and how they make sense of information, especially after high-impact news events. We have Heaven Taylor-Wynn. She's a multimedia reporter with the Poynter's MediaWise project that is a multimedia media literacy news project that reaches out especially to teens, first-time voters, and seniors. And then finally, we have Paul Anderson. He's a former journalist who covered government and politics in Florida and Washington, D.C. He now works for AARP, and he helped create the AARP Fact Tracker. So welcome to the panel. Just like the previous panel, this event is being live streamed on the different social media platforms. So just put your question into the comments. We have a team that's monitoring Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube pages for Poynter, PolitiFact, and MediaWise. And you can submit your questions and our team will get them to me. So without any further ado, let me start the questioning. And I'm going to start with Daniel Funke. Daniel, you're a disinformation reporter for PolitiFact. Tell us what kind of misinformation you've been seeing this season, this election season, and what kind of misinformation might you be bracing for on election day?
Yeah, so hey everybody, it's great to talk to you all today. really happy to be doing this panel. It's such an important time for mis and disinformation, so I'm so happy to talk to y'all. I think maybe the better way to think about this is what misinformation we haven't seen in the lead up to the election. It feels like we've all lived a lifetime over the past year or so. So I think I'm going to break it down to categories for you guys. I'd say, first of all, the misinformation that we've seen, both from the top, from the Trump administration, and from social media, are false claims about voter fraud or a rigged election or the security of mail-in or absentee ballots. So these claims, a lot of people have said, are among the most dangerous pieces of misinformation going into the election. I'll talk a bit more about like the fringy claims that we fact-checked at PolitiFact in a bit, but yeah, false claims about voter fraud, misinformation about absentee ballots. Those are claims that we've consistently seen since the pandemic began. Like the last panel discussed, we're expecting to see an influx of mail-in ballots. So that's kind of why these claims are so insidious and harmful, because they might discourage people from mail-in voting or voting altogether. So that's kind of the first basket that I think about when I think about harmful election misinformation. Another one that we've just seen a lot recently are false claims about official campaign platforms. So for example, false claims about the Biden tax plan, that he wants to tax all homes in the United States, that he wants to increase certain kinds of taxes, when in fact the campaign has said he wouldn't raise taxes on people making less than $400,000 a year. Those are some of the recurring themes that we're seeing now, especially getting closer to the election. I would say, in my experience, just trolling on social media every day, I've seen kind of like a movement away from COVID claims and more toward like traditional political claims. But that's not to say that the COVID misinformation is totally gone. That is the third big bucket I want to mention. We've seen a lot of misinformation about the severity of the coronavirus. One claim in particular sticks out to me when the Trump administration was floating the claim that only 6% of people actually died from COVID-19, and kind of misrepresented the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data there. Those claims are also especially harmful because they could put people's lives at risk in a way that I think is particularly insidious. And the coronavirus is a huge topic for this election. So I think while there are more traditional tax policy claims, I think coronavirus claims, we fact-checked hundreds of those since the beginning of the year, and clearly they're part of the election too. And then finally, we have fact-checked a lot of fringe conspiracy theories and other claims that maybe the most Americans haven't heard of, but are playing an outsized role in the election. So for example, QAnon is this baseless conspiracy theory, partly derived from conspiracy theories in 2016, that falsely claims President Donald Trump is secretly fighting a cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles, essentially. And it sounds outlandish, but this conspiracy theory really exploded this year, maybe partly as a result of people staying inside to avoid the coronavirus pandemic. It has grown around the world, not only in the United States, but in the UK and other countries in Europe. And essentially what we saw before a bunch of social media platforms started cracking down on QAnon was that QAnon pages and groups would amplify mis and disinformation, whether or not it was specifically about the conspiracy theory. So we have kind of seen that movement morph into hashtag save the children, hashtag save our children, in order to get around some of those platform enforcement policies. But it'll be interesting to see what kind of impact QAnon believers and supporters have on the election. And then finally, I think we've seen a lot of rhetoric around left-wing militant groups such as Antifa and the anti-fascist movement, again promoted by the Trump administration, but also spread widely on social media, claiming that Antifa is responsible for everything from the wildfires on the West Coast to riots around the country, when there were protests breaking out over police brutality. We haven't found a lot of evidence to support those claims, and I'm happy to send links if anyone wants more sources on that. But I would say that has also played an outsized role in this election, kind of playing into the fear that, in Joe Biden's America, or in this future America, these left-wing groups could run amok. And I think that's another important thing to note.
Thanks, Daniel. Kate Starbird of the University of Washington. That was a long list we just heard. What is your research telling you about the things that we need to be the most concerned about this election?
Yeah, I think, there's, as Daniel pointed out there's a lot of different misinformation, disinformation out there. Our research team right now is really focused on the first category of mis and disinformation that he mentioned, which is around sort of voting related concerns. And we've been looking at all sorts of different things over the past several weeks. A lot of it around exaggerated claims of problems with mail-in ballots, and a lot of effort to create and build and feed these narratives around systematic voter fraud, often building from a piece of evidence where someone takes a photograph of a dumpster with some ballots in it, and then that image gets picked up and spread and framed as some evidence that there's some kind of voter fraud. And 6 hours later, we find out that it's actually a bunch of ballots from 2018 that have been recycled, but it's already spread through these networks. And so we're seeing just a lot of effort to kind of continuously feed and build this narrative about voter fraud. And I think as we look forward to some of the things that they talked about in the first panel of like what we're facing on election night and the days after, we can see how this is sort of priming an audience and building an argument for how people may contest the election results. And so, my research is actually in the area of disaster and crisis events, and we look at a lot of cases of events where there's a lot of uncertainty. Well, this election feels very much like a crisis event in the sense that, there's already a lot of uncertainty, but thinking about election night, there's going to be sort of an unprecedented amount of uncertainty. I mean, maybe not there's going to be, it's likely that there will be a lot of uncertainty. People will be expecting results, and it will actually take some time to get those results. And what we know about human behavior during crisis events is that people don't like uncertainty. We feel anxious about it. We want to resolve it. We want to find information to fill the gaps. And that actually makes us really vulnerable to misinformation, to rumors, and also to being exploited with intentional disinformation. And so what we see already is the creation of these narratives. They're already there, and there's like this infrastructure to pick up whatever photographs or images or first-person stories or second-person stories sort of emerge on election day will be repackaged and very quickly propagated through social media networks, through cable news pundits, hyperpartisan media outlets, to reinforce these ideas that we can't trust the results. We're likely to see this in right-wing media. We've seen a lot of that already. Occasionally, we also see it in left-wing media when people, talk about the post office and they're worried about the ballots. And so we actually may see with that uncertainty that some of these narratives may take root on both sides of the political spectrum. And one of the particular narratives that we're watching is this pre-delegitimization of the blue shift or the blue wave. So this expectation that, and again, they talked about in the first panel, that because of the way that more Democrats have chose to vote by mail and more Republicans seem to be voting in person or intend to vote in person on election day, and the time that it takes to count the mail-in ballots, there may actually be a shift from more sort of Republican-leaning early counts to Democrat-leaning late counts. And we've already seen this attempt to sort of frame that shift or that wave as voter fraud. And so the audiences are primed, the narratives are the meta narratives of voter fraud are already there, and the evidence is being gathered. There's been this call for an army of Trump, of unofficial poll watchers to go to the polls and take photographs and write down your stories. Well, that becomes the material that can be taken, reframed, exaggerated. A missing ballot or a discarded ballot that may be an accident is framed as one of intent. One case is made to look like 1,000 cases. And so people may get this exaggerated sense that there's something wrong with the election. And it seems like there's an effort to use that to say, when the results change, that's going to be evidence of voter fraud. And I think it's disturbing to see the foundations of that already laid, the networks already kind of ready to spread those messages. And we've seen them activate over and over again in the lead up to the election. And we're just expecting to see more and more of that in that period of uncertainty that may come after the election.
Thanks, Kate. So I hear a lot of uncertainty and a lot of information spread virally on social media. And that brings me to Heaven Taylor Wynn, our multimedia reporter with MediaWise. Heaven, you've been working with this material for all year now. What do you tell people in your outreach efforts about what to do before they share, before they tweet, before they forward? What's the best user-friendly advice for this kind of misinformation?
There's several things that I like to suggest, but when it comes to election information or potential misinformation specifically, we like to tell people that if it causes you to have an emotional response, so whether that's a positive emotional response or a negative response, or maybe you're angry or maybe you're anxious, or you see something that makes you want to, fire off a thread of tweets in response to someone, perhaps you should just take a beat and just pause for a second, take a step back and think, is this information legitimate? And if you aren't able to tell that by just looking at the content, then we would like to suggest people to take a few extra steps to fact check the information before they share it. So there's different ways you can do that. You can open up some tabs and start lateral reading. That's when you're reading across tabs to learn more about a source of information that you've never heard of before. And I'm sure we all do this all the time. As journalists, we all have tons and tons of tabs open, but just taking that extra step to make sure the information that you're looking at is accurate and legitimate before you comment on it or further share it or retweet it for more people to see. And if the content is an image or a video, you can also try reverse image searches or reverse video searches, because like Kate was just saying, a lot of this content is taken out of context. And so it crafts a different narrative than what is the actual truth. So we really encourage people, when things make you really emotional, not to just immediately share it because you want to chime in or contribute your thoughts. Certainly there is content out there that's going to make all of us emotional, but that doesn't mean we need to share it, because it's possible that it could be unintentionally or intentionally incorrect or inaccurate.
Thanks, Heaven. That's all great advice. Paul Anderson with AARP. How did misinformation and fighting misinformation become a special concern of AARP? And what does this mean for older Americans?
Well, it's important to AARP because so many of our members are passionate about politics. We know that older voters are the primary voters, our voters in primaries and general elections in large numbers. And we saw a study, candidly, after the 2016 election that said older voters were more likely to share bad information on Facebook, disproportionately in their numbers, whether it's misinformation or disinformation. And so we got very concerned, and we're delighted that we were able to partner with MediaWise and the Stanford History Education Group. And we've developed our own fact tracker to give people tips and tricks to try and discern fact from fiction. And that's important to AARP because we're nonpartisan. We don't endorse candidates. We're trying to give our members and other older Americans the best information we can to make their own decisions. And we've seen a rise this summer in concern about not just politics, but concern about the coronavirus, concern about broader health information, concern about the economy, retirement savings, and lots of issues like that. So AARP has done interviews with both President Trump and Vice President Biden. We've done our own state-by-state election guides. They're all available online. And we're doing our best to make sure that our members are thoroughly informed and can make the best choice on their own.
Well, Paul, that's a perfect transition to my next question, which is going to go to Daniel, and it's about nonpartisanship. PolitiFact is also a nonpartisan organization. We take it very seriously. Daniel, how do you stay nonpartisan in a time when things are so partisan out in the world? And how do we hold all the various candidates and political speakers to the same standard of evidence while staying nonpartisan?
Yeah, that's a great question, Angie. And it's something I think about a lot when I'm doing my reporting as well. Always second guessing the conclusions that we're coming to, the sources we're consulting. It's something that's always top of mind. And I think the first thing that I think about when I'm thinking about trying to maintain our nonpartisanship is transparency, frankly. The more transparent we can be with our audience about how we select claims to fact check, what sources we consult, who we talk to, and how we reach a decision, the better, I think. I don't think everyone will agree with our verdicts. I think some people on staff might not even agree with some of our fact-checking verdicts from day to day, but I think the more we can point people to our sources, our methodology, and that kind of stuff, the better off we are in communicating factual information to our audience. So to that end, I wanted to say that, PolitiFact is a member of the International Fact-Checking Network, another project of the Poynter Institute, and part of being a part of that network is subscribing to the Code of Principles, and it's basically a list of principles by which fact checkers around the world must abide to be a signatory to the code. And some of those things are, listing your sources publicly at the end of every fact check. That includes every interview, links to official data sets that you used, links to other sources you used, not using anonymous sources, importantly. That's something that distinguishes PolitiFact and other fact checkers from other types of media organizations. We don't really believe that, our verdict should be based on anonymous sourcing. That way anybody can replicate them at the end of the day. So that's one thing. Another thing that is enshrined in the Code of Principles is listing our funding sources publicly. So anybody that wants to can see who funds PolitiFact, when they funded us, how much money they give us, and that kind of buys more credibility with our audience too, I think. Another thing we have to do as part of the code is list our methodology publicly on our website. So anybody can access it. They can see, how we select a claim to check, what process we go through. And then we ask our readers pretty regularly to please replicate our work and see if you reach a different conclusion. And if you do, we have a pretty open and honest corrections policy. So once we receive a correction, we investigate it and we get back to the inquiry as quickly as possible, which is sometimes tough during election season, but we try to uphold that standard. And then when we have a correction, fact checkers aren't always right. We're not gods. We publish the correction really swiftly. We say what was corrected, when it was corrected, and why it was corrected. So those are just a few of the principles that the IFCN has really held fact checkers to around the world. And I think it really, it's part of the culture of PolitiFact to approach every claim or every story idea with an air of skepticism. I think it's almost a fact checker's way to be skeptical about everything they think about and cover, almost to a fault. So I think I would point to those principles as really the ways by which PolitiFact tries to maintain nonpartisanship. And I think we're successful most days.
Thanks, Daniel. Kate, when we were talking before this event, you said that misinformation is an existential threat to democracy. And I was just really like, oh, I don't disagree, but I was like, wow, that's a powerful statement. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about why accurate, credible information is necessary for democracy?
Yeah, and I wouldn't just say misinformation. I would actually say specifically disinformation. So intentionally sort of misleading or false information that's out there that's meant to shape how we see the world for somebody else's objectives, so for political objectives. The issue with disinformation in particular is that no matter why it's applied or by whom, that it does a couple of things. It undermines our trust in information. It can undermine our trust in election processes, right? So disinformation about the election is undermining our trust in actually the election results themselves. It can undermine our trust in institutions, government institutions, media. It also historically, if we look at some of the disinformation campaigns that we've seen, particularly in 2016, that were not only sowing confusion and doubt, but also amplifying divisions and trying to drive people apart. So when we look at disinformation as kind of these multi-leveled informational attacks that make us lose trust in each other, make us lose sort of a sense that we have information that we can trust. So we lose a shared reality or a common ground. And in a democracy, we have to come together on a common ground to govern ourselves. And disinformation destabilizes that common ground. And so if we can't trust the results of the election, if we don't trust the other party in our country, and if we don't trust each other, we don't really have a democracy anymore. And so no matter what the short-term objectives of those who are applying it are, I think the outcomes of disinformation are a threat to a democratic way of governing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I agree that there's a difference between misinformation of just making a mistake or passing on something that's wrong, and then what we would call the disinformation, the campaigns where someone is intentionally putting out false information. And from the outside, it's often hard to tell the difference, although I think we get a little closer with some of our detection tools. Let me take a moment just to remind everybody watching us on live stream that we are taking questions. Put them in the comments of whatever particular live stream you're watching. We're on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And speaking of multiple platforms, Heaven Taylor Wynn with MediaWise. One of the things that impresses me about MediaWise's media literacy work is that your team seems to be everywhere. You're on Instagram, you're on TikTok, you're doing a class for first-time voters that's conducted entirely by text message. Can you just tell me a little bit more about this multimedia approach and how you see reaching out through all these different platforms?
Sure thing. So 2 years ago when MediaWise was first launched, Angie, I'm sure you remember, we were only teaching middle and high school students. We were really focusing on Gen Z, but fast forward 2 years to 2020, and now we're reaching Gen Z, we're reaching first-time voters, college-age students, and also our MediaWise for Seniors program. And so naturally understanding how each of these audiences are very different and they consume media very differently and they see the world differently, we need to reach them in a different way, you know, knowing your audience, right? And so like you mentioned, the text message course was something we were really excited about because it was really unique. You know, I'd never really seen anything like that before. I myself am a first-time voter, Gen Z, all of that stuff, and I'm constantly on my phone. I'm sure many of you are as well, Gen Z or not, but specifically, you know, as a first-time voter, we're always on our phone. That's how we receive information. And so it just kind of made sense to meet that audience where they already were and to kind of give them bite-sized information about voting, getting registered, understanding how to figure out who's bankrolling a campaign, you know, who are the corporations donating to this campaign versus that campaign, understanding how to find reliable information about these campaigns. All of that is packed into a 10-day text message course. And then when it comes to the MediaWise for Seniors program, you know, we're trying to reach America's 50+ population. We focus a lot more on Facebook with that age group. It just seems that Facebook and YouTube, based on the research, those are the top platforms for those age groups. So we're doing a lot of work with Facebook and sharing social graphics, promoting our courses, doing our best to correspond with people who are commenting there. And we look forward to creating YouTube content in the future to reach that age group. And then, as I mentioned, we begin with Gen Z. So we have a really robust TikTok presence now. In fact, many of our TikToks have been going viral organically. Just people are seeing our content, it's getting picked up and it's getting tons of shares and plays and all of that. So understanding, you know, what does your audience want to see? Where is your audience already living? And then meeting them there with content that they will enjoy. That's pretty much been our strategy.
That's fascinating, Heaven, and I think it's been pretty successful. Paul, on the issue of technology, I have to say, like, I would not want to traffic in any kind of stereotypes about age because I've seen people very young and very old who struggle with computers and technology, and I've seen people very old and very young who are whizzes with it. But how do you see this technology and seniors interacting? Do you think seniors have some sort of vulnerabilities to with their demographic group to misinformation, or do you think it's that the technology is just a tool and it's more about other things like fears of insecurity and that sort of thing? How do you balance out those different issues?
Well, picking up on Heaven's last point, we know that our audience is primarily on Facebook and YouTube, although AARP is on Instagram and other platforms. But it's not a vulnerability. We think that technology adoption is growing exponentially among older Americans. And AARP does a lot of tech education to encourage that. And it's been especially important during the pandemic because that's how people are staying in touch with family and friends. But well, you describe it as a vulnerability. I'm not sure it's vulnerable so much as, you know, you're looking at a wide range of ages and experience. You've got folks who trusted Walter Cronkite to tell them the truth every evening, and there's a generation that's been told you can, you know, believe everything you read, regardless of the channel you're receiving it. And then I think there's a good amount of confirmation bias at play here. People are getting information from one source or another Fox on one extreme, MSNBC on another, that is aligned with their fundamental political beliefs. And so they're sharing information online because they say, yeah, that's right. Some outlandish claim only reinforces something I believe about President Trump or Joe Biden or the Republicans or the Democrats. Our goal in our program and working with MediaWise is to have people take that pause before they share something. Don't automatically assume it's true just because you're able to read it or see a photograph with it. Think about the sourcing, ask those fundamental questions, because sharing it helps spread the lie if it's a lie. And we certainly don't want people damaging their own credibility or spreading bad information.
Yeah. It seems to me, and I'd be interested to hear anyone's reaction to this, that a lot of the misinformation plays on emotions, especially the strong emotions like fear or anger. What do we do to warn people about misinformation playing on their own internal reactions? Who would like to take that?
I can jump in. It's tough because there's a reason why the campaign ads do that, right? Because it works. We are human. We are emotive. We feel, and that's just the nature of the human beast. And I think that's why a lot of the candidates will do that. And so at MediaWise, we strongly and heavily encourage folks to not take things at face value, kind of take things with a grain of salt, because we are in a very contentious election season. And, each of the candidates, whether it's the presidential race or a local race, they're trying to win. There's obviously a goal. There's obviously a motive there, right? So we cannot just take what they're saying, whether it's the candidate or someone who supports the candidate, at face value. We have to do our own verification process and making sure that as individuals, right, not even as MediaWise, but as individuals, making sure that information is accurate before we are sharing it. And I think it just has to be something that comes with practice. I know that myself, as someone who works in MediaWise, it's second nature at this point, but I have conversations with my friends who are also first-time voters, and we'll talk in group chats, or we'll talk about different political current events. And a lot of times I find myself, encouraging my friends to fact check because it isn't second nature for them. So I think, like anything else, practice is going to have to make perfect. We have to, continually remind ourselves in practice to say, hey, let me take a minute, let me double check this before I share it, or before I react in such a way that's going to get me so riled up that I'm now upset about what I'm seeing. You have to acknowledge the feelings first, that they're even there.
Thanks, Heaven. Kate Starbird, how are researchers approaching the role of emotion in misinformation? Is this something that can be studied, or is it just that we have to be on our toes about it?
Well, I can't speak for all researchers here. I will say that Heaven's explanation earlier on how to manage and the role of emotion and how to kind of tune into your emotion when you're dealing with misinformation is the answer. That's the answer that researchers have so far. Certainly there are researchers that are trying to look and do sort of psychological studies on, how when you get activated by certain kinds of emotions, are you more likely to share information, misinformation, different kinds of things. And we have seen research on that fear can motivate certain kinds of information sharing, outrage, anger, these kinds of things. But certainly there's always more research to be done. And this is in some ways kind of a new focus of research. People have been doing research on misinformation for a long time, but certainly there's been a big convergence as people recognize what a problem it is right now for our society. And also that people, and we've always been information sharers, but we've never been plugged into such a big and densely connected information system. And so we almost have to learn new norms and practices and rules for how to share information, how to correct ourselves when we make mistakes, how to correct others. And certainly, emotion is going to be part of this. And so I think, there's work for research to do to understand, how to maybe guide best practices. And there's just things that we're going to have to learn as information participants that maybe in past generations we didn't need to know in the same ways.
Yeah. Daniel Funke, I have our first reader question of the night. And I know if anyone can answer this, you can. A reader asks, how are the social media platforms doing at tagging misinformation on their platforms, either putting notifications or taking it down or suppressing it? Tell us about some of the programs and how you do it. And you don't have to go through all of them, but do give us a few pertinent examples about what the social media companies are doing.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. This is a really good and timely one. This week, PolitiFact published a story actually outlining what 5 major social media companies are doing when it comes to mis and disinformation going into the election. So I won't cover that all in like 2 minutes, but if you want to read more, go to politifact.com and it is all there for you. I would say in general, it really depends on the platform, obviously. Facebook and Instagram, which Facebook owns, I would say, have done the most to label false and misleading claims on the platform. So Facebook since 2016 has partnered with dozens of fact-checking organizations around the world on 6 continents, including PolitiFact, to surface false or misleading posts. Then PolitiFact and other fact checkers fact check those posts, and if we find them to be false or partly false or needing context, Facebook actually flags those posts for users, and users who shared it get a notification saying, hey, fact checkers found this to be false or partly false or misleading. Here's a link to the fact check. They can still share it, they can still look at it, but Facebook wanted to add that context there. And also pages and groups that repeatedly post misinformation that fact checkers have debunked see their monetization taken away. They see some other privileges revoked, and eventually their page could be deleted if they share enough misinformation. So Facebook and Instagram have like a bunch of policy around this, right? They also have removal policy for stuff like claiming the coronavirus isn't as severe as public health experts have said it is, or that the vaccine wouldn't work, or Facebook also removes misinformation about voting, so false voting requirements, that kind of stuff. And that's what I would say is a common factor across all social platforms. So for example, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok all remove mis and disinformation about how to vote. So stuff like, election day is actually Wednesday, not Tuesday for Republicans or something like that. They also all remove mis and disinformation about COVID-19, depending on the topic. But I would say other platforms, so YouTube, for example, doesn't label false and misleading videos specifically, but they will, in some instances, label videos about certain topics. So whether it's about the election or COVID-19, they'll just put a little a tag below the video saying, get more information about the election here. Now, that's appended to all videos, not just false and misleading ones. So some would argue that's not the best approach, but it is an approach nonetheless. And then Twitter, I'll end on this since you asked about labeling specifically. Twitter kind of famously this summer started labeling false and misleading posts from President Donald Trump and caught some flack for it, also was praised for it in some circles, depending on what those circles are. And it isn't as transparent as Facebook and Instagram's approach to mis and disinformation, as I would say. Basically, Twitter in-house will decide which post they want to label, saying this needs more context or this is misleading. They'll add an overlay, and users can still click through to it because Twitter and other social platforms believe that the president is in the public interest, so they're not going to remove his posts outright all the time. Sometimes they do if they violate their other policies against COVID-19, but that's kind of the approach Twitter has taken, which is more ad hoc. But again, please go read our story on this. It has a simple chart at the top to break it down for you, so it's hopefully not too confusing.
Thanks, Daniel. I want to go to Paul and then Kate about the social media companies and technology. Do you think the social media companies are doing enough? Is there something you would like to see them do? Or do you think this is a user issue? What is your take here, Paul?
Well, candidly, I think they can do more. The AARP has been the victim of a number of false campaigns online. And while we have worked with PolitiFact and others to try and set the record straight and get the platforms to append those kinds of corrections or checks or whatever their choice is, their method is, it takes time. The misinformation, disinformation is spreading with lightning speed in the meantime. And so I think the public should have an expectation that they can do more and do it in a more timely way if they want to. Not to say that social media is bad. Social media has brought great advances. And as I've said earlier, as an organization, we're using it to try and get good information out and try and share important information about COVID and how to vote safely and all those kinds of issues. But I think it's a balance, and they can do more. We're working with them to try and get them to do more.
Kate, what is your take?
I mean, it's complicated. I think they're doing better. In terms of the policies we've been paying the most attention to for the last few months around election-related mis and disinformation, we've seen a lot of effort on Twitter, Facebook, other places to make their policies more comprehensive, to fill in holes of cases they hadn't thought of before. Clearly, they're not perfect. There's still a lot of work to be done, but we've seen positive changes. I think there was a positive change was that they became willing to actually add these labels to not just everyday users, but to political leaders as well. I think that's been a positive change, something that we've been recommending, especially when those accounts are some of the leaders in spreading some of this misinformation, disinformation. As Paul said, like, one of the big problems is that for these high follower or big audience accounts, when they post something in minutes, it's taken off, it's got thousands of retweets, it's spreading, hundreds of thousands of people have seen it. And by the time the label gets slapped on 45 minutes, an hour later, it's almost too late. And so we've seen them improve. So for tweets about the election being rigged from Donald Trump that they put labels on, it took 4 hours, in August. By middle of September, it was taking more like 1 hour. So definitely we could see them making improvements in that speed. But certainly, even if you wait, 15 minutes, it's already kind of having, most of the impact has already happened. So I do think there's room for improvement, but we've been, at least we've seen some positive change. But I think when we take this all down and we step back, I think we all still need to think about, why do these companies have so much power on our democratic discourse, and we have so little ability to shape what's happening there. And I think that's really something that when we get out of just the little policies and the labels and everything else, when we step back, it still seems that there's something out of balance here in our society.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. We have another reader question, turning back to election night. And this viewer asks, what sources, and it doesn't have to be news sources, should people trust for election updates on election night and in the days after? And as a little answer to that, let me ask all of you panelists, what sources do you trust and for your own news consumption? And let me start with you. News sources you trust are where people can go on election night to look for good information.
News sources I trust. So I live in St. Petersburg, Florida, where Poynter is based. So I trust the Tampa Bay Times. I'm subscribed to them. I get their email newsletters. I'm on the Steve Contorno's political text thing. I love getting texts, clearly. So I'm staying up to date that way. I'm also following some local TV news stations, although I don't have cable. I keep up with their digital content on Twitter and on their websites. And then there are a few national outlets that I check in with, but I find that I'm more in tune to the local races right now, especially one of the school board races. I'm really fascinated with that. So I'm checking in with local reporters who are covering those races and kind of just seeing what they're going to say, because they know the most about those races, obviously. So I would suggest that this person who asked the question, and for everyone really, to find local reporters who are covering the issues you care about and the races you care about in your area, because they're going to know the most about them. Almost everyone's going to be talking about the presidential election, and it's really up to you to kind of suss out who you trust based on their reporting process and all that information Daniel talked about earlier that PolitiFact shares, their funders and their process and how they issue corrections. It's kind of up to you to review that for the various national platforms and decide whether or not you want to go with them or not.
Paul, what about you? What go-to news sources do you use personally, and what would you recommend for election night?
Well, for election night, on election nights and big news events, I'm a habitual channel surfer, so I will jump back and forth and see what the major networks are saying, what Fox is saying, what MSNBC is saying. At the same time, I have my laptop and my phone going, and I'm checking other sources like ap.org, and cheered for Sally Busby and her team. NPR.org, I love public radio. And I live outside Washington, so I listen to our local WAMU, another shout out. But I think it's important to have a diversity of sources and read laterally, check what multiple sources are saying, and I do that in my regular news diet too. Of course, I get the Washington Post and the New York Times, and just important to have a variety of sources. And on Twitter, just as Heaven said, you know, you can discern over time what reporters, individual news people you trust, and what organizations you trust, and follow them on Twitter. And that's a great way of keeping on top of breaking news.
Kate, what are your news sources?
It's going to be a little bit of both what Heaven and Paul kind of explained for them. Going back a little bit, ever since COVID-19, my family has actually started to tune into the local news in the evenings for half an hour, which we found to be really valuable because it's speaking about things that we care about in our community. And I always recommend that, but just make sure that your local news is still independent, because a lot of these local news stations are being bought up by politically motivated networks. And so even for your local newspaper, I recommend it. I read the Seattle Times. There are other places where the local papers aren't independent anymore. So it's still something you have to check up on. But yeah, I recommend local media. Another thing that I tell students, if it's, you know, there is some great information out there that's free, but unfortunately a lot of quality information is behind a paywall. And so I do now have subscriptions again to the Seattle Times, our local paper, and then, you know, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Atlantic. So the things that I've found to be valuable, sometimes you have to pay for it. And then also I have a list of just journalists that I trust because I've been following them for a while, read their work, and I usually access that over Twitter. So probably on election night, I'll be getting my information on Twitter through these people that I trust. And then on the days after, I'll probably go to local media and other ones of these outlets that are mostly subscription based.
Yeah. Daniel Funky, we've seen a disturbing trend lately of some of these disinformation sites that masquerade as neutral local news sites. And like, how do people, I know you look at websites every day and trying to ferret out if they're legit. Like, what would you recommend a regular news consumer look for to see, is this really an independent news source that I can trust, or is it something that some nefarious group started to push their own agenda?
Yeah, it's a good question. And a timely one. This week, the New York Times reported that there are 1,300 different local news sites across the country, well, posing as local news sites that are all owned by this politically motivated actor. So it's, you know, it's definitely a problem. And I would just echo what Paul and Heaven said. It's really about first just reading laterally, like open a tab on your phone or your computer. It takes like 1 second to do, but it's a really important step to get you outside of whether you're on Facebook and you see a story there, or whether you're on the website and you're reading it there. Just open a tab, Google what you see. It's like, what's the name of the website? And then do a Google search, see if reporters have covered it elsewhere and actually pointed it out as whether it's a false news website or a hyper-partisan website or whatever it is. Just try to do a little backgrounding there. If you don't find anything, just look at the about page. If there's not an about page, that's a really good signal that this is maybe not a trustworthy source, because local news sources and genuine news sources will typically explain what their organization's about, who works there, what they cover. and then just kind of go from there. And if you're finding yourself kind of going down the rabbit hole and you really don't have a good handle on what this organization is about, maybe you do ask a fact checker like PolitiFact or Snopes, and we're here all the time on Facebook and on Twitter. You can DM us and say, hey, I'm not sure what this website is about, and we'll try to do a little research for you. But I would really just emphasize the importance of getting out of whatever silo you're in, because social media platforms are designed to keep you on them, and open a tab and just do a little research of your own into every website, not only websites that you might think are suspicious, but websites that look genuine to you. Just always be doing more research.
Yeah, I love that open a tab advice. It's very, very good advice. It's something I do almost every day. We are almost out of time. I have one final question that I have taken from the news, and I'd like everybody to address it. Last week, Savannah Guthrie did a very interesting interview with President Donald Trump at his town hall. And she asked him about him retweeting conspiracy theories. And she kind of scolded him, and she said, you're not someone's crazy uncle here. But some of us do have crazy uncles that we meet up with at the holidays, or maybe now we're doing Zoom calls with, or just like friends and family who are sharing something that we know is either not right or is downright wrong and not supported by evidence. What are our best strategies for dealing with this? Should we ignore it? Should we correct the person? How should we correct the person? Have you had experience with this in your own life? It's something that I'm hearing about from readers, especially from fans of fact checking. They're bothered by what they hear in their own everyday life and how they should deal with it. So let me start with you, Daniel, and then we'll go to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, it's an important question, and it's one that I'm always cognizant of this time of year when we're getting closer to Thanksgiving and the holidays. It's almost an anxiety that a lot of my friends have as well. I would say the first thing you can do is just like think about the situation. So if you see something on your social media feed, then maybe you consider your relationship to that person. Are you really close? Or are you not very close? What are you going to get out of that interaction? Sometimes it is just better to like let people live if you don't really know them that well, because they probably won't take your correction very well either. Research has shown that people accept corrections from people they know very well, which makes it really important if you see a post from a family member or a close friend that you do take the time to fact check them. So next you want to think about where you fact check them. So is it in a private message? Is it in a phone call? Is it in a text message? Think about where that person would be most likely to receive a fact check, and just do a little bit of brainstorming there. And then think about finally what sources they might value the most. So for example, one time a math teacher that I had in school shared this false news story about Hobby Lobby. And I could have sent her a Snopes link, I could have sent her a PolitiFact link, but I didn't know if she trusted the media at all anymore. So I took it upon myself to go and find Hobby Lobby's like list of press releases, and they had debunked this claim in their official website. So clearly she liked Hobby Lobby, and I was like, here, Hobby Lobby itself has debunked this claim, and she was really receptive to that. So sometimes it does take a little bit of brainstorming, like what would be the best source that this person would accept that is still a reliable source at the end of the day, that you can communicate that to. So those are some things I think about, and but there are a lot of good tips.
Paul, what do you say about correcting friends or family?
Oh, the Thanksgiving table conversations we've had. I think it's important to start from a place of respect, if it's a family member, start from a place of love and say, I'm concerned about the kind of things I see you sharing on Facebook or some other platform. You're not going to change their mind if you just get into an argument, but as Daniel just said, if you've got some evidence you can share that will be convincing to them from a source that they would trust, it's worth trying, or you can just block them on social media, I guess.
Kate Starbird, what's your take?
I mean, I guess my recommendation is with empathy, right? Like as we approach these things, it's been more and more important for me to understand my research and also in the things that I tell the general public, is just to really understand that this is happening to lots of people, and it's not because they're bad people, or it's not because they're mentally ill. It's not because they're not smart enough or they're not educated enough. It's happening to people across different populations in our country, and it's happening for all sorts of different reasons. And even if we look at our own social media history, we can see that we probably shared things that are false in the past. And so when we see things that might be mistakes, or even when people are starting to commit to an ideology that seems problematic to us, as we approach people, do it with empathy. If it's someone that you care about, do it in a private way. If it's something that you see is going viral and you want to stop it, you can do it in a public way, but just realize that you're not going to have an effect on the person who initially shared it. You're probably only going to have a downstream effect on who might see that information. But even in all cases, just realize that the people that may be involved in these kinds of ways of thinking and it's sharing misinformation, many of them, they don't mean many of them are not ill-intentioned. They're just, confused, and there's good reason right now for them to be confused.
Heaven, what are your thoughts?
I would pretty much echo everything everyone else has already said, being compassionate, approaching them in a private message if you can, as opposed to doing it publicly. People tend to not take too kindly to that if they feel like you're trying to I don't know, kind of condescend them in the way or make them feel like they're not smart. And I think something we should all consider is that most people who are smart people or are sharing information online or want to help educate others probably aren't intending to share misinformation, right? So we have to keep that in mind. I like to assume the best of people, that perhaps maybe they didn't know it was misinformation, or maybe they don't know how to fact check. So if you approach it like, hey, let's have a conversation about this. I want to understand more about why you shared this, or, what's supporting evidence do you have for this? Maybe we can talk more about it. And then you can maybe present them with evidence from a trusted source that they would trust, like Daniel said, or maybe teach them a couple fact-checking tips. I think just being solution-oriented as opposed to being like, hey, that was fake news, or that was disinformation, being compassionate and having empathy for people, because, we're all learning, we're not perfect, and we all see stuff in our echo chamber, right? There's a reason why we're seeing all the stuff that we're seeing. So chances are they may not have done it on purpose.
Thank you, Heaven. Well, this brings our panel to a close. I want to thank Paul Anderson of AARP, Heaven Taylor Wynn of MediaWise, Daniel Funke of PolitiFact, and Kate Starbird of University of Washington. This has been a very enlightening and enjoyable conversation. So for all of those of you watching our live stream, this is bringing our event to a close. I wanted to say a special thank you to people who registered for this event and made a contribution to support the Poynter Institute. If you haven't contributed, but you would like to, visit poynter.org/support. We also have a number of events upcoming that I wanted to plug because I think you'll really like them. Tomorrow night, Poynter is hosting a community conversation with Chuck Todd of Meet the Press and NBC News. So you can register for that at the Poynter website. We also have upcoming a celebration of journalism with Poynter as we honor journalists as essential workers. And we recognize the esteemed career of TV journalist Chris Wallace on November 10th. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to Facebook for making this event possible. And we hope to see you again at a Poynter Institute event. Good night.